Well, hey, this is Scott Langford from the Gen Global Educators Network YouTube channel. I'm here today with one of my colleagues on the Gen board, Chesa Caparas. Chesa was most recently a facilitator for our latest Global Educators Inquiry Meetup, November 18th, 2022, on media and information literacy in a global context, where the inquiry question was, how do you teach media and information literacy in the post-truth era? Good question. So before we plunge back into that topic and some new ones as well, let me introduce just some of Chesa's many accomplishments as my colleague. Chesa Caparas is faculty in English and Asian American Studies at the Anza College, where she teaches in the Impact, AAPI, and Flow hip hop learning communities. She's also faculty coordinator for the De Anza Women's Center. Originally from the Washington, D.C. area, Chesa attended boarding school in Switzerland before moving to California in 1999. She earned a BA and MA in modern literature from the University of California, Santa Cruz. She was a Stanford Human Rights Education Initiative Fellow from 2013 to 2014, during which time she developed curriculum on human rights violations in the tech industry. And in 2014, she was one of the recipients of the League of Innovation's Innovation of the Year Award. In 2022, she was a Fulbright Scholar to the Philippines, conducting research on media and information literacy, which is exactly where we pick up in January of 2023 to talk more about her journey as a Fulbright Scholar, including ways that we too, as community college educators, might apply to become Fulbright Scholars. Hear more about her research there in the Philippines on media and information literacy. And we'll also be diving into some other topics as well of interest to us all as community college educators. So Chesa, welcome to the Gen YouTube channel.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh yeah, well, it's so nice to have you. And of course, we work together all the time on the Gen
Mhm.
board, but we don't always have time to talk about your research life, the sabbatical that you've been on. I understand well, I do know that you're just back from the Philippines. You've been there multiple times on a
Mhm.
Fulbright, and love to hear more about what you experienced with the Fulbright,
Yeah.
what community college instructors can learn about applying for Fulbrights and the opportunities that are out there,
Mhm.
and also what your research was in the Philippines, right?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so there's a lot in that
There's
question,
a
so I'll
lot
take it.
there. So maybe
Yeah,
you could just, why don't you
I'll
tell me,
break it
why
down.
don't you start with the
Yeah.
story of how you got a
Yes.
Fulbright? How about
Yeah.
that?
So, it actually started because I was teaching in 2019. I taught study abroad in the Philippines for De Anza College,
Mm,
and I had such an amazing experience. I mean, it was great teaching the students, but also personally, it was like super life changing to be able to share like that history and that culture with students who were like really
sure.
eager to learn. And so after that study abroad trip, my first thought was like, how do I get back? And as networking happens, when I was in the Philippines for that study abroad, I met a woman who was the incoming Fulbright Scholar. And she was like, you should totally apply for a Fulbright. It would be great. And I was like, oh, are you sure? I don't know. It sounds really like intimidating and very like official and it's all government and stuff. But I went through the process. I had a ton of stuff that I was really interested in because this was 2019. So it was 3 years after the 2016 election in the Philippines, which was a very sort of infamous election in terms of media literacy and disinformation.
Mm,
And so I crafted this research project about media and information literacy. And really, I was curious about it from an educator's perspective, like how do educators teach media and information literacy, especially given like in the Philippines, like they're like the highest globally, like, I think they had been the highest internet users for a long time. I think now they're second,
mm.
but they also have the highest penetration of Facebook. So it was just like a really interesting area to study. So I applied for the Fulbright, got accepted. Yay. Thanks to Karen Miller, who was the incoming Fulbright scholar who mentored me a lot in that process. So I got accepted, got the notification in February of 2020. Month later, we went into lockdown because of the pandemic and
No.
just, yeah. So it was like, years of uncertainty, anxiety. I mean, it still is, there's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety for people But the Philippines reopened in, I think, February of 2022.
Yeah.
So then Fulbright, actually the Philippine American Education Foundation, or PIEF, they're the Fulbright office in Manila. They were like, okay, country's open, we're ready to welcome you. And I was like, oh my gosh, really, it's happening. I was so excited. And so then got the ball rolling. I went in April. Of course, my research project had shifted because it was now about to be the next presidential election in May of 2022. Again, a lot of discussions, debates around disinformation, the impact that social media was having on democracy. So those kinds of topics. It was a very fraught time to talk about it. So I definitely had to adjust my research a little bit just to be sensitive to some of the anxieties and fears that people were having around talking about media literacy. So again, it was really focusing on educators, really trying to figure out how do they navigate challenging conversations in such a polarized political climate, especially when a lot of the polarization happens online and not necessarily like in person, because there is, people act differently online than they do in person. So that was it. I spent 5 months there conducting research, interviews with educators, and it was amazing. It was also, from an academic or scholarly perspective, it was so eye-opening and I learned so much. But then, of course, from a personal perspective, being a Filipina but who was born in the United States, it was my first time living in my ancestral country for that long. And I absolutely loved it. I felt such a big difference living in Asia, especially, being a minoritized person in the United States. So living in Asia was I definitely felt different in my body over there. And it wasn't just because of the humidity. Yeah. And I actually really love the humidity and the heat, which was surprised even myself. And it was great. I made a lot of really great connections with academics. I'm actually going back to the Philippines next month because I am presenting at De La Salle University. So I'm really happy to have kept those sort of like academic connections, as well as the personal and familial connections.
Yeah, well, it certainly sounds like the payoff, as someone who's thinking of applying for a Fulbright myself, right? I've had several colleagues get Fulbrights, and I'm going to admit openly, I didn't realize until some of my colleagues started to get Fulbrights that community college instructors could get Fulbrights, right? So I
Yeah.
think one of our missions here today is to say, hey, why don't we all be like Chesa? And
Well,
why don't we all apply for Fulbrights? Because it seems like the Fulbright Foundation is fully open to the idea
oh
and
yeah.
fund tons of Fulbrights for community college educators, but not all of
Hmm.
us are aware. So I'm looking at, oh, look at all that paperwork, and I have to fill out all these forms, this sort of like pain versus payoff ratio. Now that you're far enough along in there, it sounds
Yeah.
like you're very happy that you went through the process of application, even though I'm sure it is the usual, like, oh my God, I have to get all these forms filled out and get like
Yeah.
letters of recommendation. How long did it take you to apply?
I mean, actually, I came back and I was committed, and I was still, we're fortunate at Foothill De Anza that we're on quarters. So I came back at the end of July. And
Yeah.
so I didn't go back to work. I didn't go back to teaching until end of September.
Well, from your
And I think,
campus abroad, from the initial
yes,
campus abroad,
yes,
you mean? Yeah.
yeah. So it took me, and I think the applications are due around like mid or late September. I can't
Yeah.
remember. But so I just dug my heels in and just applied and like created this. I had an idea of what I wanted to study, but I got a lot of feedback. I talked to my colleagues. I cannot express like how thankful I am, like so much gratitude to all the people who helped me, because you do have to get letters of recommendation. You have to talk to your dean. You have to talk to, I think I needed to get clearance from VPI, stuff like
Some
that.
DPI of something
Admin,
or other.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. The admin has to be involved. But again, like my campus was super supportive. I really owe a lot to Karen Miller, who helped me with my application, because what I think helps for community college educators applying is like, say you're applying from like a research university, you might have this heavily like research focused proposal,
Sure.
but the goal of the Fulbright is really about cultural exchange. I
Ah,
mean, like, of course, like they want you to do rigorous research. They want you to
sure.
have like a really sound
Well,
project,
yeah, this is
but
key. I
it's,
love this.
yeah, no, it's really about like, how are you going to bridge these two cultures, these two countries? As community college educators, we're always thinking about how we impact our community, how we connect with our community. And so I feel like it wasn't that hard for me to sort of tone down the like academic research voice, because I'm already thinking about how do I make this a community minded, like cultural exchange type of
Yeah.
application.
Oh, we're community college instructors. That's what we do, right?
I
So
know, yeah.
no, that's really encouraging to hear that. And I think the mentorship part, I mean, I will certainly reach out to you and my other colleagues that I know have been out there. And I do know that Fulbright runs workshops for community college
Mhm.
instructors. I'll mention I checked on the website, and
Okay.
there are clearly Fulbrights available for community college administrators also,
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
faculty
Yeah.
and admin. And I think that's a really exciting thing. Did you already have an existing relationship when you applied with a college or university in the Philippines because you had been there? Was that part of the package?
Um,
Or were you just saying I want to go to the Philippines kind of in a larger sense? I'm not sure.
yeah, no, that's a really good question because you do have to have like a sort of sponsor, like a university that sponsors you or hosts you.
Mm.
And so when I taught study abroad, we were based in UP Diliman. And so I had a contact over there who was like, "Oh yeah, I'll be happy to sponsor you and we'll like help you get settled and give you an office and all that stuff." And so I was like, "All right, sweet." I had the connection. But of course, as I mentioned, the pandemic hit.
Yeah.
And so by the end of by the time I was allowed to go back to the Philippines, like that connection had changed because the faculty person had like, taken a leave. And this has happened to other Fulbrighters that I talked to who were there when I was there. And so, but just so you know, like Fulbright is very accommodating, as long as you have another faculty sponsor. I was able to find another host really quickly.
Well, that's good.
Um,
Right. So it
yeah,
didn't
and they
blow up
were,
the whole thing just because,
yeah, no. And I
thank
honestly, I
God.
was like losing sleep over that. I was like, oh my gosh, am I gonna be able to go? I did all this hearing, I can't go. But I was able to connect with other people. And what's nice is the Fulbright website also has a list of like, I think previous host universities. So
Yes.
if you don't have
You don't, you
one,
can find
you
one.
can
Yeah.
start reaching out. Of course, it's better if you have a personal connection or somebody who can introduce you, but like they still have resources for you to find a host.
Okay, and that mirrors the advice that I've gotten all along, but have not managed to implement yet, but plan
Yeah.
to. What were your days kind of like? I mean, how can you describe, was there even a typical day? Maybe that's a silly question in the middle of an epic election, an epic
Yeah.
polarizing election in the Philippines in a pandemic. Maybe that's a very silly question, but is
No,
it
no,
possible to
no.
answer it?
No, yeah, it is. I'm just laughing because if I tell you what a typical day was, you're gonna be like, "Oh my gosh, you didn't do anything." Because I felt that's how I felt for like the first month. I was just like, it was just immersion. It was just walking everywhere,
Sure,
trying to do as many things as possible, trying to meet as many people at the
sure.
university as possible, and just listening. I was just like a sponge for
Mm,
that first month, especially because I knew that my topic was really controversial. I was like,
yeah,
I'm just going to see what people are willing to talk about. Like I'm not officially
sure.
interviewing everyone. I'm just getting the
Mm,
landscape. I listened a lot and I observed a lot, even just little things of like, okay, when you're at a restaurant, this is how people order. When you're
yeah.
at, because it's, all of that stuff is very different. And if I'd been to the Philippines several times before, but even some of those little things I had to just
Yeah.
like sit and watch and like try and get acclimated to it. So yeah, for the first month or so it was just observing and little things like trying to get internet in my apartment, like figuring out where to do my laundry. I mean,
The
like,
basics.
yeah, all of those things. It seemed like I wasn't doing a lot, but fortunately I had a friend, another Fulbrighter who is trained in ethnography and anthropology.
Mm,
And so she was like, just journal every day and write down everything. It was like the
there you
smells,
go.
the way your body feels, like the heat, the sweat, like all of it, just document everything. And it was
Wow.
such great advice because I think, when you move to a new country, for me at least, it's like so much about fitting in that I try to
Yeah.
ignore what feels different. But
Hmm.
when I started taking note of everything that felt different, then I felt like I was actually like learning. I don't know, like it was easier to acclimate because I was actually like noting
Right.
my reaction to things. So that was like the first
It's
month.
like phase one in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was also like, I even told my host university, I was like, I'm just going to be listening and then I'm going to refine my research project based on some of the conversations I'm hearing. Again, because I wanted to be really sensitive to like what the community was willing to share with me. And so then I changed my topic, and then the whole like ethics review process, I was going through that for the first couple of months. And then once I was able to go through that, then I took
I have to pause. What was the ethics review process?
it was quite a rigorous process, but I was super thankful for it. Like one of my colleagues here in the US is like, you can write a whole paper on just what you learned from the ethics review process.
Okay.
But because I was interviewing humans, like human subjects, like I had to get clearance.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. For the non-anthropologists, can you, or the non-socioethnographers, can you give us a little background? Because I'm still a little unclear on what the ethics review process
Oh
is.
yeah, sure. I mean, it's basically just, you write an informed consent form, like, kind of detailing the purpose of the study, the protections that are in place for the like interviewees or the, subjects, or, the people that you'll be talking to. You have to have an expert in the field, vet your interview questions. So that kind of stuff. And so I went back and forth with some
Mhm.
of the experts on my questions,
Sure. Wow.
just to, yeah, and it was super helpful. Like,
Wow.
because I'm also like, you and I were in literature, right? So I'm like,
Right.
I can teach you how to like analyze the heck out of this poem, but in terms of conducting social research, I felt
Yeah.
I very much had imposter syndrome, and so I was super thankful that the
Mhm.
ethics review committee was very patient and giving
Well,
good
it grows
feedback.
your network too, right?
Mhm.
I mean, that's also social interaction. Was the
Yeah,
committee in the US? Was the committee in the Philippines? Was the committee all over the globe? Was the committee based in the
yeah.
Fulbright? Where did your committee come from?
I did both. Like I tried to get because I had done institutional research at De Anza, and
Mm.
so I asked one of the institutional researchers. I was like, can you just like tell me if I'm doing this right? Because again, I had so much imposter syndrome. I was like, I'm
Oh,
used to like my subjects are like novels and like books of
sure.
poetry. And so I was like, making that transition to talking to humans was, I wanted to be really respectful. Looking back, I was like, oh, maybe I was too cautious that first month, maybe I should have probed a little bit more. But, I just remember like being very, very concerned that about like the comfort and the sort of safety of people who would talk to me. So yeah, I talked to some people at my institution. I talked to the committee at the host institution. I even talked to colleagues who are anthropologists and ethnographers. Because I was like, am I doing this right? Again, like just so much gratitude towards all the people who supported that project. And yeah,
Okay, well, so now I get to ask my question again. So, what was phase two? Now that I understand that phase one had a lot to do with ethics reviews, as well
yeah,
as just engaging in social networks. I mean, if you're going to analyze social networks digitally or otherwise, you have to have some feeling for the social networks that you're in
right, yeah.
physically,
Well,
right? Yeah,
yeah,
because that
and
how else can you understand what's going on? So that totally
yeah,
makes sense to me.
yeah,
Uh, but
and
then as you start to change gears into a little bit more
yeah.
formal question asking, is that what came next, or?
Yes, that came next. And then also a lot of reading. I was also teaching or prepping to teach. I was hosting workshops because coordinate our women's center at De Anza. So I have done gender work. And so I was helping to support the gender work at my host institution and at other colleges in the area. So it was research, actually doing the research, conducting the interviews and focus groups, and then hosting workshops. And honestly, like the last 2 months, it was sort of like just totally kicked into gear. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm like doing, like lots of prep, lots
Right.
of, research, like, trying to code the results and everything. And then also, since I'm on sabbatical, I was working on my sabbatical project, which is an annotated bibliography on
I see.
the topics that I'm studying, like media and information literacy or digital literacy. Yeah.
Well, do
Yeah.
you want to try to nutshell some of your conclusions
I
about?
could see a lot of parallels between elections in the Philippines and elections here, particularly around like the ways that people were talking about how social media might have manipulated the
Yeah.
information that was circulating about different candidates, how polarizing it was. And so a couple things that I think are really important to understand about the Philippine context. One, it really is about who you know in the Philippines. Philippines is very much, it's a high context culture which is that, people aren't very direct in their speech. It really depends on body language and sort of
Mhm.
internal, like sort of inside jokes and inside references. So you have to really know the culture
Yeah.
to to effectively communicate. And so, as much as I sort of, criticize myself for taking too long at the beginning and just observing,
No,
it's
this
it's
is
actually,
brilliant.
yeah, it's part of what you have to
Absolutely.
do. And I think that was my main finding from the research. Well, one of them was that the goal of media and information literacy isn't to just like fact check and verify sources, but it's about building trust, because we are living in an age where trust in institutions like schools, like news outlets, that trust is being eroded. And so people are getting information from like TikTok and Facebook that they trust more than the information that they might get at a school or from like an established news source. So it really isn't just about saying, you're wrong, you need to
Mm,
read like this publication for right information. It's more
right,
like, how do I get you to trust me
right.
so that you listen to me and we can have an actual conversation?
Mm,
Because I noticed there's a lot of, one of the things that came out of my research is there are a lot of ways that like people shut down debate, which doesn't just happen in the Philippines,
no, as we all know
Yeah.
far too well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
But even in like my observations of some of the conversations that take place online, like when there are people commenting on like political speeches or rallies or something,
Mm,
it's like people on one side were called elites, like, oh, you're just being like this intellectual elite, you're trying to give me facts, you're trying to tell me like that I'm wrong, that I'm reading the wrong information, you're just like up there. One of the terms people call it is like smart shaming. It's kind of a form of anti-intellectualism, which again we also see in the US with all this stuff around vaccines.
sounds
And
familiar. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. I
exactly.
was thinking about the vaccine and like trying to build trust with communities that have been underserved or very
Yeah.
negatively served for generations,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden we're coming in and say, trust us. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
takes a little time.
Yeah.
That's not an
Right.
instantaneous conversation.
Right. And especially thinking about it for myself in like the sort of post-colonial context, right?
Mm,
It's like, someone from like a Western country is coming in and saying, you're wrong, you have to believe what we say as truth. Like it just perpetuates that colonial imperial mindset of telling these colonized groups that, oh, you have the wrong information and you have like the
right.
wrong version of reality. So I was trying to be very, very cautious of not,
Good.
like not telling anybody that I know anything better than they do.
Yeah.
Another way that people shut down debate is like, oh, you're just a troll, like, oh, you believe in this political candidate,
Mm,
you're just trolling, oh, you're probably some bot, like they would just, like
mm,
when people were commenting online, it's like, oh, look at this troll, like they have like no followers, blah blah blah, they're probably just a fake account, which could be true or not,
yeah.
because there was a lot of troll farms, like
Yeah. So
uh
it's possible.
yeah, yeah,
Although,
yeah,
as
yeah.
we know, you're not a troll.
Right,
So
I'm not a
we
yeah,
know that, but they don't necessarily know. I mean, again, they
right,
don't they don't necessarily know that, right?
yeah,
Like we
yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah.
Was there a gent, since you're partly because you work with the Women's Center at the Anza,
Hmm.
my sister college, as we say,
Yeah.
um, was there a gender dimension to the discourse that you were observing? I'm not sure. That's not something that came up in the presentation at the inquiry meetup, but
Yeah, yeah.
but I am interested. I know it's part of what you look at in literature and what and
Hmm.
your role at the Anza. So I'm
Yeah.
wondering the extent to which it feels very gendered or does not or didn't or interesting. And now I'm trying to think of that in our own social discourse, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Highly complicated. In other words, like, oh well, it's super complicated. The answer isn't
Hmm.
super complicated. But
Hmm.
what was if I ask the question, does it make any sense to say was
Yeah,
there a
no,
gendering dimension in these discussions?
definitely. Well, one thing that comes to mind is like, so the two candidates who ran, and it's
Right.
one thing I noticed is that when I talk to people in the Philippines, nobody named
Mm.
candidates. Like
Oh,
they were just
really?
like, oh, well, you have one candidate who's like this and one candidate who's like that. And they
Oh,
didn't want to like name it. Of course, like some people were very like vocal about who they
okay.
supported, but if I didn't know the person very well, they'd be
Mhm.
like, oh, well, you have people supporting this candidate, and they wouldn't name them. But again, it's that high context culture where it's like
Yeah.
they give you cues about who they might be talking about, but you're never quite sure.
Oh,
But we had two, the big presidential race was between Bongbong Marcos and Lenny Robredo. One of the things I noticed was, there was a rally for Lenny while I was there, and it's very much like even just the aesthetic reminded me of some of the women's marches I'd been to in
interesting.
the US. So like pink hats, like the little pussy hats and whatnot.
Okay.
Um, and so very pink, very, and their Lenny's supporters were called Kakampinks, because it like very much played up
Okay.
the kind of feminine energy or the feminine vibe of it,
All right.
which you also saw in the US, like
Right.
opened it up to these sort of misogynistic critiques, right? That, women aren't strong, that they're, you know what I mean? They can be emotional, that kind of stuff.
All that nonsense.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And especially coming from President like Duterte, who very much ran on the strongman rhetoric.
So
I
the
think that
rhetoric is
was some
already
of the
super
gender stuff.
gendered already in the
Right.
political debate in a way, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
As it often is in the United
Yeah.
States. Different. We did talk about this in the inquiry meetup, and it really stuck with me. Like, how is it different to look at someone else at another culture's social media debates? I mean, you're getting out of your own bubble and you're looking at someone else's bubble. I guess is my quick shorthand
Mhm.
to try to say this, if that makes
Yeah.
any sense. So
Yeah.
and you've got bubbles behind you in your background.
Yeah.
So how did it feel to go from the bubble on one side of you to the bubble on the other side of you? Like, was that part of it for you
Um,
to feel like an observer instead of a participant?
in terms of the social media stuff, like I created a separate Instagram account for just my Fulbright stuff, because
Okay.
my personal account is private. Like I don't want a bunch of like random people following me, but I was like, you know what? I do want to share and it was just observations, just things that I was observing about my time in the Philippines. I created this account and I was posting, it was sort of like a blog, basically. Like my experience of trying to get internet in my apartment, which took weeks. And as soon as I got it, I tell you, I binge watched that whole day. But just observations like that about how, things take longer. But, one of the beautiful parts is that you learn to be patient and you learn to I even quoted my late grandfather. His catchphrase is "cool ka lang." It's like, just be cool. Like,
Oh,
just relax. So anyway, so I opened that Instagram account and I had like, some observations of my time, and then suddenly it got shut down.
mm.
And I don't know why. I filed several tickets around, like, I don't know why this account got shut down. I don't know why. I
Oh,
didn't post anything about my research. It was really
wow.
just like, this
You
is,
don't have any idea what happened.
yeah, yeah.
Funny.
So that was interesting. Still wondering if I'll ever get that content back, but whatever. If you're watching Instagram, please restore that account so I can get that content. The other observation that is super interesting is, I mean, you have to remember, like I do some like work on the digital divide, right? And
Right.
so internet access most people access internet through their phones, but because they have limited data, like data costs a lot of money.
Yeah.
The way that things get reported is very different. If you're on Facebook, they'll give you a certain post will be free
Yeah.
up to a certain
Up
amount.
to a point. Yeah.
Yeah. So then people try to squeeze as much information into like the little headline as possible,
Mm.
because that way you don't have to use your data to read the whole article.
Uh,
So that's, another interesting thing is like
no, that's a big
things,
deal.
yeah, like they really condense the information, which of course, people talk about that as leading to poor literacy rates and like poor, like sort of critical literacy, and that people don't get the full story.
Mm.
The other thing I noticed is that when you go out to the provinces, I mean, there's like billboards everywhere in Manila, but when you go out to the provinces, like all the sari, the little convenience stores all have these huge banners that say free TikTok for all. TikTok like has these promotions where you just get like free TikTok. And that was one of the platforms that was sort of called out the most for circulating disinformation, or a lot of folks like to use the phrase historical distortion, historically distorted information on that
Gee.
platform. There are a lot of really great studies on the sort of disinformation industry. So Jonathan Ong and Jason Cabañas put out a study that looks at disinformation industry, but from like all levels, not just the influencers who are spreading the stuff, but the PR firms that are backing them. And then, the politicians who are funding the PR firms or hiring the PR firms. And so you really feel that politics, and this is true in the United States as well. And, like politics is really just marketing, is PR. So if someone can control their image really well, that is maybe the biggest marker of potential success.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds unfortunately deeply familiar. So,
Yeah.
it's just
Yeah.
so